The forest seemed alive, its gnarled branches clawing at the fog as if warning intruders to turn back. He had walked hours without sight of the village, yet suddenly it appeared, a cluster of decaying houses huddled beneath the shadows of ancient oaks. Lanterns flickered in crooked windows, casting pale, trembling light across the muddy paths. His first glimpse of the women froze him, 3 of them, young yet hollow-eyed, moving like specters between the buildings, their steps measured and silent, faces etched with a sorrow that seemed older than the village itself. Villagers scurried past, muttering cryptic warnings, refusing to meet his gaze. Whispers floated through the mist. Chosen ones, they said, selected not for love or duty, but to bear the children of a line cursed long ago, a secret so vile it had to be concealed behind generations of obedience and fear. As night fell, the air thickened with an unnatural chill, carrying the faintest hint of decay and the soft echo of cries that could have been the wind or the damned souls trapped here. Every shadow seemed to watch him, every rustle among the trees a warning, yet he could not turn back. The forest pressed closer, and the realization sank deep. He had stumbled into a place where the past refused to rest, where innocence had been twisted into a legacy of horror, and where every heartbeat might mark the moment he became part of a curse that had survived centuries. Key point 1. The stranger's arrival ***. The forest was dense, ancient, and almost sentient, its shadows shifting with a subtle rhythm as though watching him approach. Every step he took seemed muffled by layers of rotting leaves, moss, and the soft, spongy undergrowth, yet he could hear the echo of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears louder than any footfall. A cold, clammy mist hung low, clinging to his clothes and curling around his face in thin tendrils that obscured the path ahead. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and the low groan of wind through the gnarled branches carried faint, almost human whispers that made him hesitate, unsure whether he had imagined them. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, he pressed on, drawn by the faint glimmer of light in the distance, a subtle glow that promised the presence of something living, something that might offer shelter, or perhaps answers. As he pushed through the final line of trees, the village emerged suddenly, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Its structures were irregular, low to the ground, and made from weathered timber that had darkened over decades of neglect. Roofs sagged under the weight of moss and the years, and small windows, dimly lit by flickering candles, gave the impression of watchful eyes. Smoke curled lazily from a few crooked chimneys, though there was no smell of cooking, only the acrid tang of wood burning on damp embers. The silence of the village was disorienting, broken only by the occasional creak of a door swinging on rusted hinges or the distant drip of water falling from the roof into shallow puddles. Every building seemed deliberately positioned to block sightlines, forcing him to move slowly, cautiously, as if the village itself was a labyrinth designed to trap intruders. He became aware of subtle movement, shadows flitting just beyond his line of vision, the impression of figures watching from the edges of the fog. The few villagers who appeared briefly at doorways or windows quickly disappeared, their faces pale and unreadable, their eyes glinting with a mixture of fear and suspicion. There was an almost ritualistic quality to their behavior, a stillness that suggested they had been trained or compelled into silence. As he stepped closer, the first hints of the women appeared, glimpsed through half-open doorways or between clusters of trees. They moved slowly, deliberately, their expressions distant, almost hollow, like they were aware of forces far older than themselves and entirely beyond his comprehension. The traveler felt a chill creep up his spine, an instinctive warning that the forest and its hidden village were not merely inhabited, but alive with secrets, and that his arrival had not gone unnoticed. Every instinct screamed that he had crossed a threshold into a place where time and morality were warped, and where curiosity could be as dangerous as the shadows that clung to the woods, patient and silent, waiting to see what he would do next. Key point 2. First glimpse of the women ***. The first sight of the women struck him with a mixture of fascination and unease, a moment that seemed suspended in the dense, fog-laden air. They emerged quietly from the shadows, their movements deliberate and almost ritualistic, as though every step had been rehearsed countless times in secrecy. Each woman was of similar age, their features pale and delicate but marred by a hollow emptiness in their eyes that seemed to reflect lifetimes of fear and resignation. Their clothes were vintage, worn, and patched with care, yet the tattered fabric did nothing to conceal the aura of oppression that clung to them like a second skin. Even at a distance, the traveler sensed that these women carried a burden invisible to the outside world, an inherited weight that shaped their posture, their expressions, and the way they held themselves in the dim light of the village. They moved through the village streets like phantoms, never speaking, their gazes fixed somewhere beyond him, beyond the buildings, as if tethered to some unseen force compelling them forward. Every so often, one would glance briefly toward the traveler, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear, caution, and a glimmer of silent warning, before swiftly lowering her gaze to the cobblestones beneath her feet. It was not just their behavior but the aura surrounding them that unsettled him, a delicate balance between fragility and the weight of unspeakable knowledge. Even the smallest gestures, the tilt of a head, the clasping of hands, the careful positioning of feet spoke of lives dominated by control and ritual, of a world in which autonomy had been systematically stripped away. As he watched, he noticed subtle signs of strain in their appearances, dark circles beneath their eyes, pale skin stretched thin over delicate bones, and the slight tremor of hands restrained by the need for obedience. It became clear that these women were not merely living under the village's oppressive rule, they were embodiments of a secret passed down through generations, an unbroken chain of influence and domination that had molded them before they even knew who they were. The air seemed heavier around them, the fog curling with a quiet insistence, almost as if the forest itself had learned to accommodate their presence, bending light and shadow to highlight the unnatural stillness that clung to them. The traveler could not escape the impression that he was observing a hidden hierarchy of fear and ritual, that these women were simultaneously subjects of curiosity and victims of an ancient, clandestine purpose. The villager's cautious avoidance of his gaze and the women's own silent, deliberate movements made him feel that he had stumbled into a theater of secrets, each participant playing a role they had been assigned long before his arrival. Every glance reinforced the terrifying understanding that the lives of these women were not their own, that their existence had been designed for purposes they could neither question nor escape, and that his presence, however innocent, threatened to disturb the fragile, sinister equilibrium that had been maintained for generations. Key point 3. Whispers of the curse ***. The traveler soon realized that the village itself was steeped in a pervasive hush, a silence that pressed down on him more heavily than the mist that clung to the trees. It was not merely the quiet of isolation or the natural stillness of the forest, it was a deliberate, cultivated silence, one that seemed to extend from the villagers' very souls. Their eyes darted nervously whenever he looked directly at them, and their movements were careful, almost choreographed, as though each step or gesture might summon consequences too terrible to imagine. The first hints of the curse came in fragments, whispered conversations intercepted in hallways or through cracks in the doors, hushed enough that he struggled to piece together their meaning. Words like chosen, bloodline, and inheritance floated through the fog, entwined with an almost reverent terror. It was clear that the villagers did not speak freely of the women or their purpose, not out of discretion, but out of fear of exposure, fear of reprisal, fear of awakening something that had slumbered for generations. He began to notice the peculiar weight in the women's expressions and posture, a subtle yet unmistakable mark of those who bear knowledge too heavy for their age. When they passed through doorways, the men and older women would bow their heads, avert their eyes, or retreat into shadows, as if the women carried an authority born not of age or choice, but of some dark necessity. The traveler's presence seemed to disturb the delicate balance of secrecy, drawing glances that were simultaneously anxious and warning, as if even a single misstep in awareness might awaken the curse into motion. Pieces of old tales reached him from villagers' lips in fragments, legends of a family so obsessed with purity and continuation of bloodlines that they had designated certain women for a singular, horrifying purpose, ensuring that the family's lineage remained unbroken, untainted by the outside world. At night, the whispers became more audible, carried through cracks in the walls or drifting through the fog-laden streets. Words he could scarcely comprehend reached him, references to rituals, to lineage, to obligations that transcended personal choice. The women themselves never spoke, yet their presence seemed to validate the villagers' fears, and he realized that the curse was not just a story or a superstition, it was lived, enacted every day, a suffocating truth maintained by terror and tradition. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to twist unnaturally when he looked toward them, the weight of generations pressing into the air. Every glance, every murmur, every averted gaze reinforced a grim understanding. This was a place where innocence had been systematically stripped away, replaced by an inherited duty so horrifying it could not be named aloud, a curse perpetuated in silence, whispered only in dread, and carefully concealed behind the veils of obedience, secrecy, and fear. Key point 4. The hidden journals ***. In one of the more dilapidated houses at the edge of the village, the traveler discovered a doorway partially concealed by hanging cobwebs and the skeletal remains of an old curtain. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of decaying wood, but there was also something else, an underlying metallic tang that set his nerves on edge. The room appeared abandoned, yet it held traces of careful preservation, shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, papers stacked in uneven piles, and faint remnants of ink that had survived decades of neglect. As he approached, he realized that these were no ordinary records. The journals were filled with meticulous accounts, written in a spidery, precise hand that suggested obsession as much as devotion. Every page seemed to pulse with the weight of secrecy, the dense script describing events, decisions, and rituals that had been hidden from the outside world for generations. The traveler turned the pages cautiously, the brittle paper trembling under his touch. There were entries chronicling the family's history, their careful manipulation of marriages, unions, and bloodlines, and the deliberate selection of women whose lives would be devoted entirely to the preservation of a singular, horrifying lineage. Names were recorded with precision, alongside dates, observations of physical and mental traits, and meticulous instructions for ensuring compliance. The journals described in cold, detached language what the villagers whispered of in fear. Certain women were chosen before they could understand their place in the world, groomed from childhood to fulfill a purpose that went beyond any normal human relationship. Every detail was accounted for, from the way the women were to be instructed in obedience to the subtle rituals ensuring the secrecy and continuity of the family's legacy. Some pages contained crude diagrams and symbols, obscure markings that seemed almost ceremonial, suggesting rites performed in dimly lit rooms or deep within the forest. The descriptions were clinical yet horrifying, detailing actions that stripped the women of autonomy while enshrining the family's obsession with purity and bloodline. Occasionally, a phrase would leap from the page, a sentence that captured the cruelty and inevitability of the system. The chosen must carry the line, their desires are irrelevant. They exist solely as vessels. It was a statement repeated with such regularity that the traveler felt it echoing in the very air around him. As he read, a creeping realization took hold. This was not merely the record of one family's eccentricity, but a codified, systematic chronicle of abuse, control, and generational horror. Each journal built upon the last, creating a lattice of inherited oppression that extended far beyond what could be witnessed on a single day. The full scope of the village's darkness revealed itself here, in ink and parchment, a secret hidden in plain sight for centuries, and the traveler understood that by holding these journals, he had stumbled upon a history that was as damning as it was inescapable, a record that connected past to present, and hinted at futures yet unfulfilled, bound inexorably by the family's relentless, unyielding curse. Key point 5. ***, the vanishing ***. The night the first disappearance occurred, the air in the village was heavier than usual, thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint tang of smoke from crooked chimneys. The traveler had noticed subtle signs earlier: windows hastily shuttered, shutters rattling in the wind, and a sense of movement just beyond the fog-laden streets, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of what had happened. One of the three women, the youngest and most hesitant in her movements, had vanished without a trace. Her absence was immediately palpable, felt in the hushed whispers of the villagers who dared not speak her name aloud and in the tension that seemed to coil around the remaining women like a living thing. The traveler followed the faint trail, noticing first the signs in her small room, the bed untouched, the sheets folded with an almost obsessive care, yet strange, scrawled markings etched into the walls and floor. They were symbols he could not decipher at first glance, angular and chaotic, yet they radiated an ominous intentionality, as though the act of drawing them had been both a plea and a warning. There was no sign of struggle, no indication she had left voluntarily, and yet the atmosphere suggested a presence or a force that had taken her. He felt the weight of the village press down on him as he examined the room, the shadows seeming to twist unnaturally, extending just slightly beyond the reach of lantern light, as if alive and observing. Outside, the The villagers reacted with a mixture of fear and resignation. Some averted their gaze completely, while others whispered half-formed explanations in low, urgent tones. It was the curse, they said, the family's will, the forest itself. Every word he caught reinforced a terrible truth. The disappearance was neither random nor accidental. It was a consequence of forces that had shaped the village for generations, forces designed to ensure the women remained trapped within a system they could not escape. The traveler sensed that the missing woman had not simply vanished into the night, but had been removed by ritual, by design, to reinforce the family's control over the lineage and maintain the continuity of the bloodline that had dominated the village for centuries. As he lingered near the house, the silence became oppressive, pierced only by the faint rustle of leaves in the fog and the soft, distant cry of something or someone that might have been the woman herself. The traveler's unease grew with every passing moment, for he realized the village's shadows were more than the absence of light. They were witnesses, participants in a system that consumed the innocent to preserve itself. The vanishing was not merely the loss of one young life, it was a revelation, a living proof of the curse he had only begun to understand, a stark, terrifying illustration that in this hidden world, the forest, the family, and the women's fate were bound together in a relentless, unbreakable cycle that offered no mercy, no escape, and no explanation that could ease the horror of witnessing it firsthand. Key point 6. Confronting the matriarch. The traveler's first encounter with the matriarch was nothing short of unsettling, an experience that seemed to warp time and space in the dim interior of her home. She emerged from the shadows of a large, sparsely furnished room, her presence commanding without a word, as though the very air bent around her. Her appearance was deceptively fragile, an older woman with sharp features, hair streaked with silver, and eyes that glimmered with an unsettling intelligence. Yet there was an imperious quality to her gaze, a sense of control so absolute that it caused the traveler's chest to tighten as if the room itself were drawing him into submission. The walls were lined with relics, faded portraits of past generations, and shelves cluttered with books and artifacts that spoke of centuries of meticulous planning and secrecy. It became immediately clear that this woman embodied the very essence of the family's dark legacy, a figure whose authority had been honed over decades and whose understanding of the village's secrets surpassed that of anyone else present. The matriarch's voice, when she spoke, was low and deliberate, each word measured as if carved from stone. She did not ask questions, nor did she extend pleasantries. Instead, she conveyed the weight of knowledge accumulated over generations, a knowledge that was both oppressive and inescapable. Her observations were unnervingly precise, noting the traveler's hesitations, the subtle tension in his shoulders, and the way his eyes darted toward the corners of the room. It was as if she could see not only what he had witnessed but what he feared to admit. When she spoke of the women, her tone was clinical yet terrifying, acknowledging their roles within the family with a calmness that made the horror of their existence all the more palpable. She described the selection of women for the bloodline, the rituals that ensured compliance, and the punishments that maintained obedience, framing each atrocity as necessary, inevitable, and natural within the context of the family's obsession with preservation and control. The traveler felt a cold pressure building in his chest as he realized that confrontation with her was not a mere meeting. It was a test, a subtle assertion of dominance meant to gauge his intentions and his understanding of the family's power. Every movement she made was precise, calculated, and imbued with authority. A hand gesture, a tilt of the head, the slight narrowing of her eyes, all reinforcing the silent message that resistance was not merely futile but dangerous. The matriarch's presence created a tension in the air that was almost tangible, a suffocating atmosphere in which he could feel the reach of the family's influence pressing in from all sides. In that moment, he understood that the village's darkness was not simply inherited or passive, it was embodied in her very being, a living instrument of control and fear, and that any attempt to challenge or escape it would require a courage and cunning far beyond what he had imagined, for the matriarch was the linchpin of a system that had endured unbroken for generations, ensuring that the curse remained unchallenged, omnipresent, and utterly inescapable. Key point 7. Visions of the past. As the traveler wandered deeper into the village, the oppressive atmosphere began to manifest in ways he could scarcely explain. Shadows seemed to shift with a life of their own, and the flickering candlelight cast shapes that morphed into faces, eyes wide with silent screams. It was in these moments that the first visions began, sudden and intrusive, as if the village itself had decided he must witness the horrors that had accumulated over generations. The images came unbidden, overlapping and indistinct at first, glimpses of women in rooms much like those he had seen, faces pale and hollow, carrying expressions of resignation, fear, and despair. The air around him seemed to hum with unspoken memories, a resonance of suffering that transcended the physical boundaries of time and space. These visions grew more vivid as he lingered near the older buildings, the edges of the forest pressing closer, the fog curling with an unnatural intent. He saw the past unfold in disjointed flashes, women being observed from darkened corners, their movements guided by invisible hands, whispered instructions delivered by elders whose faces were stern and emotionless, nights filled with fear, broken only by the cold light of lanterns and the shadows of those who ensured obedience. He began to understand that the curse was not merely a present reality but a living, breathing inheritance, replaying itself in every corner of the village, in every room, in every glance exchanged between villagers. The women he had observed in the present were but the latest incarnation of a lineage meticulously molded and controlled, and each vision reinforced the sense that escape or resistance was unthinkable. At times, the traveler could hear faint voices overlaid on the visions, echoes of the past that whispered secrets, cries, and confessions. Some voices were pleading, others resigned, all bound by the weight of a family tradition that demanded silence and submission. The visions were relentless in their insistence, forcing him to witness not only the physical realities but the emotional torment endured by the women, the crushing isolation, the terror of being chosen for a purpose they could neither refuse nor understand, and the quiet, suffocating hopelessness that defined their lives. In one particularly vivid episode, he saw a ceremony conducted in a dimly lit chamber, women kneeling with eyes lowered as older figures inscribed marks, muttered incantations, and ensured the perpetuation of the bloodline. The images were fragmentary yet detailed enough to convey the precision and ritualistic obsession that characterized the family's obsession. The traveler felt a growing nausea, a realization that these were not mere stories or legends whispered among villagers, but living testimonies etched into the very fabric of the village. With each vision, the weight of the past pressed upon him more insistently, a terrifying reminder that the curse had endured through centuries of obedience, secrecy, and fear, and that the women he had seen were not exceptions but part of an unbroken chain of suffering that defined the soul of the forest and the heart of the village itself. Key point 8. The threat of exposure. The traveler soon realized that his presence in the village was no longer inconsequential, that the fragile balance maintained by generations of fear and silence had begun to shift the moment he arrived. Subtle changes in the village's behavior indicated a growing tension. Doors closed a fraction of a second too quickly, shadows lingered where there had been none before, and the women he had observed moved with even more deliberate caution, as though aware that their actions were being scrutinized not only by their own family but by an outsider. The traveler could feel it in the air, a silent awareness that he had seen too much, that the glimpses of journals, the fleeting observations of the women, and the faint echoes of the past had set something into motion. He was no longer merely a witness, he had become a variable in a carefully controlled system, one whose delicate equilibrium could be disrupted with catastrophic consequences. At night, the forest seemed to close in around him, fog thickening and twisting unnaturally, shadows lengthening in ways that defied logic. He began to sense the presence of watchers, fleeting glimpses at the edges of his vision, villagers who should have been asleep, or hidden in their homes, appearing suddenly on pathways, behind trees, or at windows. Their eyes held a cold vigilance, an unspoken warning that he must not reveal what he had discovered. The traveler understood that the family and the villagers were not relying solely on secrecy or tradition, they were actively enforcing it, extending their influence like invisible fingers, ensuring that the truth of the women's roles remained buried. Even the women seemed affected by his awareness, their movements more constrained, glances flicking toward him with a mixture of pleading and terror. The traveler could sense their fear, the silent understanding that exposure might bring consequences they could neither prevent nor survive. It was not only his life that was at stake, the fragile lives of the women, bound to the family's dark legacy, depended on his discretion. Every encounter became a test, every conversation a minefield, any misstep could trigger suspicion or retaliation, and the traveler felt the weight of generations pressing down upon him, a burden of responsibility heavier than he had anticipated. As the hours passed, it became increasingly clear that the village was a network of surveillance and control, where every gesture, every whisper, and every shadow was a potential threat. The traveler felt hunted, not by a single individual but by the collective force of a community bound together by fear, loyalty, and centuries of ritualized oppression. The realization settled over him like a shroud. To leave the village with the knowledge he had gained would be dangerous, but to remain silent risked complicity in horrors that had persisted unchallenged for generations. Each night, as the fog crept through the trees and the faint cries of unseen figures echoed through the village, the traveler understood that the threat of exposure was no abstract concept. It was a living, breathing presence, patient, calculated, and capable of reaching into the very soul of anyone who dared to uncover the family's darkest secrets. Key point 9, ***, the secret ritual ***. The traveler's discovery of the ceremonial chamber revealed the full depth of the family's obsession and the systematic horror that governed the village. Hidden beneath one of the oldest houses, accessible only through a narrow, twisting staircase that smelled of damp stone and rot, the chamber exuded an air of oppressive secrecy. The walls were dark and slick, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly in the flickering light of a single hanging lantern. The floor was worn uneven from centuries of careful repetition, as though countless footsteps had traced the same path over and over, a testament to rituals performed without interruption for generations. The traveler's heart pounded as he stepped inside, the weight of history pressing down on him, an almost tangible force that seemed to thrum with anticipation. At the center of the room lay artifacts both mundane and sinister, old wooden implements stained by time, ceremonial knives whose edges had been honed to a precise cruelty, and faded cloths marked with sigils of unknown meaning. Every object spoke of meticulous planning, of acts performed not in haste but with deliberate, ritualized precision, each element intended to enforce compliance and maintain the continuity of the family's bloodline. The traveler noticed that the chamber's arrangement mirrored the hierarchy of power he had glimpsed in the village, the matriarch at the center, her authority radiating outward, the chosen women positioned with care, their movements constrained and measured, their expressions a mixture of fear, resignation, and reluctant obedience. As he observed, he began to piece together the purpose behind the rituals. The chosen women were brought into this chamber at predetermined ages, their lives marked and measured by ceremonies designed to remind them of their singular function. Symbols were inscribed on their skin, chants were recited to reinforce the weight of tradition, and subtle psychological and physical manipulations ensured that the lineage remained unbroken. The traveler realized that these ceremonies were not merely symbolic, they were tools of control, indoctrination, and subjugation, intended to create a chain of women who were simultaneously aware of their roles and powerless to resist them. The air in the chamber seemed charged with the echoes of past participants, their suffering and compliance woven into the very fabric of the room. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and the traveler could almost hear the faint whispers of those who had gone before, pleading, cursing, and surrendering to a fate they had no means to escape. Every detail, from the placement of artifacts to the sequence of actions performed, reinforced the inevitability of the family's plan, a plan designed to perpetuate a curse that had survived centuries. The traveler understood, with a mounting dread, that this room was the heart of the village's darkness, the nexus where tradition, control, and cruelty converged, and that to witness it was to see the machinery of horror in motion, relentless and unyielding, a secret preserved with precision and an almost reverent devotion that left no room for mercy, escape, or reprieve. Key point 10, ***, the ultimate choice ***. The traveler soon realized that his knowledge of the village's horrors had placed him in a position from which there could be no easy retreat. The forest surrounding the settlement seemed to pulse with a life of its own, thick fog curling along the ground like spectral fingers, each step forward or back feeling heavier than the last. He understood that leaving without confrontation would mean abandoning the 3 women and the countless others trapped in the family's oppressive cycle, yet to confront the matriarch and the villagers was to invite a danger whose magnitude he could scarcely comprehend. The choice before him was not simply between action and inaction, it was a reckoning between survival and moral responsibility, a perilous balancing act that weighed each heartbeat against the relentless shadow of centuries-old cruelty. Every encounter he had endured until this point had prepared him for the gravity of the decision, yet nothing could fully convey the enormity of what lay ahead. The villagers' behavior had shifted, their wary glances sharper, their movements more deliberate, as though the very air had begun to sense the precariousness of his presence. Even the women, whose lives had been governed by the family's strict and unyielding control, reacted differently now, their subtle gestures tinged with quiet desperation. They were aware, in some instinctive way, that he had glimpsed too much, that the veil of secrecy had been lifted even slightly, and that the weight of his choices could reverberate through their already fragile existences. In the dead of night, the traveler examined the journals, the ceremonial chamber, and the scattered remnants of the rituals, all converging in his mind like pieces of a grim puzzle. Each revelation amplified the urgency of action. To leave silently would preserve his life but betray the innocent, to resist would risk his very existence and place him squarely in the machinery of oppression he had been attempting to observe. The forest seemed to close in around him as he contemplated the consequences, shadows stretching unnaturally, the faint whispers of past victims echoing in the trees, warning him of what defiance might bring. Every instinct screamed caution, yet conscience pulled him forward, insisting that knowledge of such a darkness carried a burden, a responsibility that could not be ignored. As dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale light through the mist, the traveler felt the oppressive weight of the village and its matriarch pressing from all sides. The choice crystallized into a stark, almost unbearable clarity. He could flee and ensure his own survival while leaving the women and the curse intact, or he could confront the family, risk unimaginable peril, and attempt to disrupt a cycle that had endured for centuries. The implications of either path were terrifyingly clear. One promised safety at the cost of complicity, the other promised danger, uncertainty, and the potential for violent retribution, but also a slim chance at justice and liberation. The forest and the village seemed to watch, patient and unyielding, and he knew that the moment to decide was imminent, that hesitation could seal his fate, and that whichever path he chose would forever alter not only his own destiny but the lives of those caught in the relentless machinery of a darkness that refused to release its grip.